want to spotlight.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. May I ask you to please mute yourselves, make sure that your mics are muted as you join the meeting. I'll give it a couple of minutes. I see there's still people in the waiting room joining. And then we are going to start. People are still connecting. I'm just gonna give it a minute or so. If everyone could make sure the mics are muted, please, as you join the meeting. And we're gonna start shortly. All right, I think we are going to start. Welcome everyone to this history workshop webinar, which is also the last seminar for this year's program. And it's really a great pleasure for us to welcome Professor Bob Edgar, who's joining us on Zoom from Washington. Welcome, Prof. His paper today is titled The Emperor's Gold, David Kgobe, Prince Wanni Yusaf, and Tales of a South African Flim-Flam Man. Professor Edgar is the Emeritus Professor of African Studies at Howard University, as well as a research fellow at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. He's taught in universities across the United States and Southern Africa, and published numerous books, the last one of which is a biography of Josie Mpama. He's also got a long-standing association with the Wits History Workshop, which goes back many decades, and so it's really wonderful for us to have you with us today. We circulated Prof's paper before the seminar, so I'm hoping that participants have managed to read the paper, but Prof is going to speak to the paper for about 25 minutes and 25 to 30 minutes, and then we'll take some questions and comments from the audience. I think that's it from my side. Please welcome Prof, and over to you.
Thank you, Ariana. I'm very pleased to be with you all today. As she said, I've had a long association with the History Workshop, and I'm very pleased that she and Noor were able to make some space for me to present this paper that I've been thinking about for many years. Now, of course, in 2024, we're inundated with many con men, and women for that matter. This word con comes from the word confidence, people who are trying to gain our confidence and, of course, take our money. So on a daily basis, I get all sorts of scams coming in, either over my phone, text messages, emails, especially. It's quite a lot. So I've been fascinated by this story of David Kgobe, who went as Prince Wanni Yusaf for many years. Now, how did I come across this story? Well, in the National Archives, many years ago, decades ago, I found large files on him in the Native Affairs Department, in the South African Police, and in the immigration authorities. The first two in Pretoria, the last one in Cape Town. And I started putting together the story, and I mentioned the story to Phil Bonner, and Bonner loved it, and he said, "Look, you've got to you've got to put this together." And but it took me a long time before I had the time and space to really reconstruct this fellow's life. And it was not easy because most of the documentation on him accepted his identity as an Ethiopian prince. But there were several revelatory moments in Ethiopia and in England where he had to come clean. He had to tell people that, yeah, I'm really a South African and I need travel documents urgently. So I'm a British national. And so we have records of him appealing to his school teachers, to the Native Affairs Department for documentation so that he can get travel documents. So what do we know about his background from these fragments? One, he's born in the mid-1890s, although he changes the date quite a lot. His father is a Pentecostal minister in the Northern Transvaal. His early education is in Northern Transvaal schools. And then he moves to Kimberley, where he goes to several very top-notch schools, St. Matthew's and Lyndhurst, both of whom have excellent track records for their graduates. After leaving those schools, he gets teaching posts, and one of them is in Schweitzer Reneke. There he teaches for a while, but he also becomes involved in the ICU, the Independent Commercial Workers Union, as an official. And during the late 1920s, there's quite a bit of protest going on that the ICU is organizing in the town, but also in the region. In the early 30s, he moves to Johannesburg and forms his own firm, Kgobe and Kgobe, which deals in financial issues and estate issues. But eventually he moves to Cape Town, and that's when he makes his first name change to Wilhelm Jolson Barker. I've often wondered why he makes the name change in Cape Town, but I have a feeling it had to do with the sort of racial divisions in Cape Town, and that if he used an African name, that would not work. But when he gets to Cape Town, he gets enthralled with the Marcus Garvey movement. Now, I won't go into details about Garvey. That's been written about extensively. But one of his mentors is a man by the name of James Taili, who was a leading Garvey exponent in the Western Cape. He also has correspondence with Marcus Garvey, in particular about attending a Congress that the Garvey is organizing in Jamaica. Of course, anytime anyone has correspondence with him, he then begins to embellish the story about his background. And I go into great detail about all the stories that he has. And so it's about that time in 1934 that he begins fabricating this new name change to Prince Wanni Yusaf. I'm not sure where this name comes from. I've checked with Ethiopian scholars, and they're kind of confused about where it might originate. But you might ask the question, well, why Ethiopia? Why not, since he had connections with Garvey, why not change his identity to an African American? Well, Kgobe was probably familiar with Wellington Buthelezi, a Zulu who had changed his identity to Dr. Hansford Butler Wellington and led an American movement in the Transkei and Ciskei in the 1920s, which was very popular. Instead, he chooses Ethiopia. Why Ethiopia? Well, Ethiopia was a powerful image among Black South Africans. One, because it was an independent and sovereign African country that had withstood colonialism. They had defeated the Italians in 1896. And secondly, it was a religious icon. It was an early home of Christianity. More importantly, it was an early home without European mission involvement. And so for Black theologians, Black ministers in South Africa, the name Ethiopia had a lot of potency. And so the Ethiopian movement in South Africa was about using this name Ethiopia for their churches. Now, there's a couple of interesting twists with his conversion to Prince Wanni Yusaf. One is he meets a fellow in Paarl, Jagrefa Zorani, who is a destitute older man. He claims to be a claimant to the throne in Ethiopia. Now, keep in mind also that Haile Selassie had become emperor of Ethiopia in 1930. So that was also a major factor in terms of the recognition of Ethiopia. But Zorani claims he's a claimant to the throne. And of course, in Ethiopia, if you were not on the emperor's side, you might end up a terrible fate. So he creates his own story. I've never been able to determine if Zorani actually was an Ethiopian. Now, another factor in his Kgobe's activities was he meets a Joel Magadi, who lives in Port Elizabeth, but he becomes involved in the ICU, and in particular in the independent ICU that Clement's Kadalie had formed, breaking away from the ICU in the early 1930s. It was based in East London. Well, Magadi had his own problems with Kadalie, and he forms his own branch of the ICU called the African Legion. This was something new to me. Now, the African Legion, the name actually comes from a wing of the Marcus Garvey movement, so I thought that was very interesting. But the African Legion had entry fees of £2, five shillings. They set up a fund for uniforms, a car allowance, which would not be used until later. And Kadalie began to amass a significant amount of money, which he is going to use to support Kgobe when he is forced to leave South Africa. Now, of course, Kgobe becomes very interested in involvement in various affairs in the Eastern Cape, and the South African government is not sure what to do with him because they're not clear about his identity. And ultimately, they decide to deport him. They say, "You're from Ethiopia," you say. Well, we're going to deport you to Ethiopia. And he really doesn't put up a resistance to that. And so in July of 1935, he's put on a ship to Djibouti. And Kadalie actually sends him a considerable amount of money to finance his trip and his living in Addis Ababa. Of course, he gets to Addis Ababa, and it's not long, October 1935, when the Italians invade Ethiopia. Now, by early 1935, Kgobe is beginning to wonder when are the Italians going to reach Addis Ababa? Well, that won't be until May of 36. But he begins to lay the groundwork for getting out. And of course, that's when he makes an appeal to the British consulate in Addis for a document, and then he reaches out to his teachers and the police and Native Affairs in South Africa. He even tells them, "I'll tell you exactly where my fingerprints are in the Criminal Investigation Department." But he's able to extricate himself from Ethiopia. And I think there was a promise that he would go back to South Africa. But instead, he heads to London. And again, Kadalie sends him additional money, which is remarkable. But he and his wife, who's traveling with him, make it to London. And he's actually living in an area, living very close to Marcus Garvey, although I have no evidence that Garvey and him met in London. But that's when he begins to concoct all sorts of schemes based on his experience in Ethiopia. He claims to have been a major diplomat for Emperor Haile Selassie in the lead up to the war, dealing with the Italians, with the Japanese. But more importantly, he claims that the emperor had given him the gold in the Ethiopian treasury to smuggle into South Africa. Significant amount of money. Now, mind you, the Ethiopians did not have a gold reserve. They used Maria Theresa dollars. But of course, that becomes his story. And he's able to use it as a way of conning people into giving him money. Basically, he says, "Look, if you loan me money, if you give me money, once I get access to the gold, I'm going to pay you back doubly. And of course, Ethiopia was in the top of the minds of many people, but in Britain at that point. And he's able to exploit this. He also does it with Africans living in London. In particular, there's one Ugandan, a lawyer by the name of Alfred Mayanja. And he takes some money from him, and Mayanja finally files a report with the police. Well, it's apparent that the police are investigating him, and it's clear that he's going to have to leave. Once again, he goes to the British officials and says, "I'm really a South African. and I want to get back to South Africa. Well, he's made enough money from his cons that he's actually able to rent or book a deluxe suite on a on an air on a liner, gets to Cape Town, and right away he's arrested by the South African government for a charge from the early 30s. But he gets back to Johannesburg, and he rents a flat, well-appointed flat. He hires some luxury motor cars. He's quite a he's quite a remarkable figure. The South African officials tried to arrest him on a number of occasions, 4 times. He's able to get white lawyers to get him off. They're not able to really stop him. And of course, in the late 30s, when he comes back in 1938, Ethiopia is still a major story in the Black community, the outrage against the Italians invading Ethiopia. So he begins to make forays into the Free State, talking to educated African groups about his role in Italy. And he's successful for a while, but finally they begin to get on to him. And one person in particular, Kgobe, who had been his assistant in the Free State, realizes that he actually is a fraud. And Mote turns against him in a major way. Okay, so all of this begins to unravel for Kgobe in the late 30s. In England, he had come up with an idea for starting a blanket corporation, the Mark Trading Corporation, which would produce cheap blankets for the Black community. And of course, the Black community would profit from it. No blankets were ever actually produced, but there could have been factors for that. But he uses that corporation as a way to raise money from Black investors who would subscribe to it. And that becomes the basis for the South African government bringing a case against him. But the situation that really gets the South African government outraged is that in the late 30s in the Petty area, in the Ciskei, he taps into a rumor that the Ethiopians and the Japanese are coming to liberate Black South Africa. So Kgobe and his associates go out there and they say, look, we have access to the Ethiopia and the Japanese. We also are going to produce gas masks because remember in Ethiopia, the Italians had used mustard gas against the Ethiopians. Well, that's the last straw for the government. And in 1940, they arrest him and put him on trial in Port Elizabeth. Now, this is a show trial. The head judge is the head of the Supreme Court of the Eastern Cape, Lansdowne. Kgobe does not have legal defense during the trial, but the trial itself takes 2 months, hundreds of witnesses, hundreds of documents. It's an extraordinary trial. And in the end, he's convicted of fraud for taking people's money and putting it into his personal account. Now, the thing that kind of baffles me is that the people who were investing in his corporation, they really didn't see it as a fraud. They thought he was trying to do a good thing. So if a fraudster is not seen as a fraudster by the people he's defrauding, is he really a fraudster? Well, I'll leave that up to you all. But he goes on to served 3 years in prison. He's released on probation. And you might think, well, he's learned his lesson. But no, he's back to his antics, and he has another great idea, and that is he wants to set up cinemas in Black townships. And so he's looking for investors in Port Elizabeth and in Cape Town. And in Cape Town, he hoodwinks a Malay businessman into assisting him, lets him live in his home. It's just quite an amazing arrangement. And finally, of course, his fraud is revealed, and he's put on trial in Cape Town and given another 3-year sentence. Now, when he's released in 1950, you might think, well, is that going to cure him of his antics? Well, not his antics, but he doesn't get involved in fraud cases anymore. And in the abstract of the paper, I really don't talk about this, but he gets a job as an insurance salesman, and he's very successful at it. You can imagine his ability to sort of talk glibly and win people over to buying insurance from him. He's so successful that when he goes back to Johannesburg, the ANC knows about him, and they actually approach him before the Defiance campaign in 1952. Now, I'll let you read the paper to find the outcome. But Walter Sisulu, bless him, does his due diligence and finds out that, yeah, this guy is very shady. In the early 60s, Drum magazine does an expose on Kgobe. It's called The Amazing Prince Yusuf. And there they recount all his fraudulent activity in South Africa in the 30s and 40s. Well, by that time, Kgobe had had a stroke, but he was so invested in his identity as an Ethiopian prince, he was worried that his clients might wonder about him if he didn't respond to Drum, and he brings a defamation suit against Drum. Well, the case is heard in 1962, I believe, and 63, sorry. And their Drum, of course, has their attorneys who reveal all the things about him that he had done in the past, and he loses the case and actually is fined a considerable amount of money. Now, in closing this presentation, I want to read to you from the conclusion of my paper, and then we can have a short PowerPoint and open it up for discussion. Compared to the modern digital grifters who are running amok globally, David Kgobe's takings as a fraudster were piddling, and they indeed were. But he still adhered to the playbook of the con artist. He was a master of self-invention and deceit, who created an identity as an Ethiopian prince that appealed to his target audience, Black South Africans. He created business enterprises such as a blanket manufacturer and cinemas that appeared on the surface to benefit Blacks, but were really for his personal gain. He perfected all the skills of the classic con man, winning over people's trust and confidence with what seemed to be plausible stories about his life, taking advantage of Black people's positive images of iconic figures such as Emperor Haile Selassie, and identifying with the struggle against the Italian invasion. and relying on stories revealing his swindles did not spread quickly or widely. The latter is important because once fraudsters are exposed, they often wait for the outrage to subside and move their act to another area. Even though Kgobe was a skeleton, there is another way to look at his life that helps to explain why some people could be fooled by him. He was like the Akan trickster, Anansi the spider, who used cunning and trickery to outsmart more powerful figures, in this case, the South African government. In South Africa, he brazenly flaunted the conventions of how a Black person was supposed to act under white rule. Even though his actions brought retribution from white authority, his defiance of white authority had a certain appeal to many whites. Nearly 40 years after the Drum defamation case, the actor John Machikisa recounted how Kgobe attracted the admiration of some Johannesburg Africans for his ability to, quote, hustle and easy living and sidestep the horrors of the invidious past system. He lived an ostentatious lifestyle, renting a well-appointed apartment, driving sporty cars with a chauffeur, starting businesses that were supposed to serve the Black community, refusing to carry a pass, and defying the rules about marriage between different racial groups. He did marry an Indian woman in the late 1940s. So on that, I want to conclude, and I'll ask Ariana to use the PowerPoint. I've got a few slides that I want to show that give you some indication of David Kgobe. Ariana?
Can you see them?
On the left is actually, it's not a good photo, copy of it. I've got a much better one. But this comes from a British magazine, John Bull, Crooked Prince Treasure Scheme. And of course, it's an expose of what he was doing in London in 37, 38. Next one. Here's a mugshot of Kgobe. Next one. Now, here's a column, Public Enemy, also in 1938 in this magazine, John Bull. Again, I hope I'll get a much clearer photo of him from that. Next one. Now here's the fellow Zerani. This is from a Cape Town newspaper who claimed to be a claimant to the Ethiopian throne. Next one. Next one. These are members of the African Legion in Cape Town, dressed in their uniforms. And they all had very elaborate titles, Baron of Pondo, so on and so forth. This also appeared in a Cape Town newspaper. Last one. Well, these are his fingerprints that were on file in the Criminal Investigation Department. So this is a work in progress. And one reason I wanted to make this presentation today is that I've been so concentrating on reconstructing this story, and it is a long story, that I may not be seeing the wider picture of social history. And so one reason I wanted to present to you today is because I'm hoping that I'll get feedback from you on your take on Kgobe, how he fits in a larger South African scheme, and scholarship that I have not been familiarized with. One final thing, you've seen these photos of Kgobe. One thing that always puzzled me was, why didn't people in South Africa see that he wasn't from the Horn of Africa? I think one reason was that very few South Africans, black or white, had any familiarity with Ethiopia. He spoke only English. At his trial in Port Elizabeth, an Ethiopian who was present and testified said that he addressed Kgobe in Amharic, and of course, Kgobe couldn't respond. So it's an interesting twist to the puzzle of this man. Let me conclude on that note, and I'll be glad to take any of your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Prof, for the wonderful presentation and summarizing a very complex story for us. I'm gonna take questions and comments from the audience. If you can please show your hands, then I will ask you to unmute and ask your questions, or you can also put the questions in the chat if you're unable to speak. Let me check the chat.
I don't see the names of everybody yet, but I see Cynthia and Alan, so hi to them.
There's about 27 participants, I guess, from all over. I see Alan's got his hand raised as well as Noor. Alan, we'll start with you and then take Noor's question.
Hi, colleagues. Good to see you all. Bob, wonderful. Thank you very much. Really, in a way, a simple question, but I happen to have in my files the story of somebody who I think of as a remarkably successful imposter, starting from earlier years of the 20th century, also in South Africa, a real foreigner, but who was able to misrepresent himself in a number of different countries, including the US, Australia, etc. But I'm not, it's something that I want to get back to writing at some stage. And I will be in Australia at the end of the year, and maybe I'll get to some archives. But really what I don't know is what other South African literature there is, or for that matter, comparable literature in other parts of the world that would deal with, you know, in a way, not necessarily the same identical kind of story as your character here, who's quite fascinating, but others, whether in your country or in mine, or anywhere else for that matter, particularly in mine, because I'm simply not familiar with that literature. We have, of course, the stories told by Charles van Onselen and other historians about people who weren't necessarily imposters, but who managed to get away with extraordinary activities. But I'm interested in people who managed to misrepresent themselves. Usually we eventually know about these people because the law, the police, the tax authorities, or whoever eventually caught up with them. Anyway, that's my question. Thank you so much for this fascinating story, and I wish you well for yourself, but also with continuing this quest. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. Bob, is it okay if I take a couple of questions, or would you rather respond one by one?
Well, let me start with Alan's, and then I'll take several more. There is quite an extraordinary literature on con men. historically and, of course, in the present. In my paper, I have a section at the beginning where I deal with people who, in the United States especially, who come up with different identities to identify with indigenous people. So for instance, there were a number of people who identified with, Black Americans who identified with the Zulu history in South Africa and remade themselves into children of Hetwayo. There was also one notable case I cited where a fellow reinvented himself as a Native American and led a very checkered career in not only the United States but in Europe as well. So there is a vast literature on this topic, and in particular, I tried to isolate the examples where people are living in dominant cultures and they identify, in this case, white culture, and they identify with indigenous cultures and by changing their identities. Okay, Ariana.
Thanks, Bob. Nora, would you like to come in?
Yeah,
And then I
thanks.
see Leo's hand.
Thanks, Ariana, and thanks very much, Bob. I really enjoyed the presentation, and I managed to have a quick look at the article itself. So I've got two, I think, potentially interrelated questions. I was very struck by how Kgobe kind of connected himself at different points in time to political movements. And I wonder whether, you could say something about, I mean, is there something about his politics? So, so it's ICU, it's the ANC, it's, Garveyism. He invokes the, Ethiopian struggle against Italian colonialism. So yes, he's a con artist, but he also operates in this world of politics, right? Of Black politics, emerging kind of movements and so on. Was it all just a ruse, or was there something political about him that one could kind of discern from the research that you've done? It seems to me that there is something about Garveyism. Your kind of reference to James Taylor is very interesting, and the kind of connection to to Wellington Buthelezi. Seems to me there's a kind of a world there that takes shape, that perhaps allows for, people to make grand claims about who they are and what promises they could make about the liberation of African people, invoking Ethiopia and the like. But I was struck by his politics, and what he did not have time to explain was his sort of very radical views around the time of the Defiance campaign. So again, was that simply a con, or did it reflect a particular political disposition? And then it's an issue that you raise as well in the paper, and that is, even though he does get caught out and he gets sentenced, he's able to kind of negotiate his way around white officialdom in different parts of the continent, and as well as in England. And I wonder whether that says something about how the kind of white colonial authorities viewed someone like him. Yeah, there seems to have been some degree of tolerance until, he got caught out. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, it was clear that Kgobe had an intimate understanding of what was going on politically in South Africa. As a teacher, of course, he had that experience in the ICU, and a number of top ICU figures had come to Schweitzer-Reneke to give speeches. So he clearly had a an understanding of what was going on in South Africa at that point. When he gets to South Africa, Cape Town, and the evidence that we have of his ties to the Garvey movement, we know these things because the police confiscated letters in his home that he shared with another guy. And if you look at the substance of these letters, it's clear that he's very outraged by white oppression. He really does identify with not only the struggle in South Africa, but global oppression, racial oppression. His connections with the African Legion and Joel Makade. So while he has this understanding of what's going on in Black politics, he really is very independent of the main political movements. So he's actually quite skeptical about the ANC and what they're doing. He's got his own path, and he expresses this on a number of occasions. But most especially in the early 50s, when Walter Sisulu approaches him because they've heard about this guy. Sisulu knew him as an estate agent in the 1930s, and he knew that he wasn't a prince, but they approach him because they think he might be able to add something, and they go to the offices where he's selling insurance, and they find this guy actually has white employees. They were just stunned by that. The way Sisulu describes it is they go into his office, and when he comes in, they stand up like a white judge came into a court. You stand up. But Kgobe had these ideas about going to the Soviet Union. He would work for the ANC and go to the Soviet Union to purchase weapons. Now, I wish I had more about that. When I knew Walter, I wish I had known he knew this story, because I would have been interested about the details. But in the end, Sisulu inquired and found out that this guy really was not what he seemed to be. Quite a talker, but that was about it. So in the end, when you look at him and his associations with the mainstream Black political movements, he really had an understanding of what they were doing. He was very aware of what they were doing, but he also maintained a very independent line. Now, I think there might have been a second question as part of your query, but I'm forgetting it.
Yeah, no, it's okay. I was just kind of wondering, Bob, about the attitude of white officialdom in kind of both kind of. There seems to have been a degree of tolerance, right? He was clearly under some surveillance, and he does get caught out, but it's allowed to operate. I wonder what one makes of that.
In South Africa, you mean?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. After he's convicted in Port Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Okay. All I have from that is that he did, once he was released in 1945 at the end of the Second World War. I'm not sure how he made his living. He clearly had some support from white businessmen, but I don't really have details on that. I'm sure the South African officials kept an eye on him just to find out what he was doing, but he still had the wherewithal to set up this new scheme for cinemas in the Black townships. So one of the things I'm very struck by is that while the South African police were ubiquitous when there were certain issues they had to focus on, especially political issues, they were less so in the case of Kgobe. And I wish I had more details for you about what he was doing and whether he was being actively monitored after he left prison in 45. But the documentary record is just not there.
Thanks, Bob. I've got Neo. Neo's hand is up. Neo, would you like to come in? Are you there, Neo? I see your hand up, but we can't hear you. Can you
Ariana,
hear me?
Neo
I
is still
think
muted,
my
so
connection is
if
a bit
he's,
unstable.
If you can hear us, you should
Can
unmute.
everybody hear me?
No. I'm saying Neo is still muted.
Neo? Okay, I've got Lawrence. Lawrence's hand is up. Let's take Lawrence first. Let's see if I can hear you.
Yeah. Hi, Bob.
Hey, Lawrence.
Thank
Hi,
you for
Lawrence.
fantastic paper. I just wanted to ask about the fact that your statement that people didn't really see it as some of his actions as fraud. I know you've given some justifications as to why not, but I don't know if you can expand on that a bit. Also, just in the context of in that period in the late 1920s, different ICU leaders were accused of corruption and stealing membership money and so on. And in fact, that contributed a bit to the decline of the ICU in certain towns. You know, the one guy, Jason Jingos, was, they thought he was going to go build a hotel in Johannesburg with the money. You know, a similar kind of genre of ideas. But I just want to get a sense of how people didn't see it as fraud and how anyway.
Okay. I guess there are two elements of that. I think if you look at it in terms of, well, first of all, there were, you're correct that there were a number of ICU leaders who, once the ICU disbanded, they went on to many different careers. And I think if someone, and I hope they do, did profiles on many of these people, you would find that they had very checkered careers subsequently. I hope you all can hear me. There's something on the screen.
Yeah. We can hear
At
you.
any rate, so Kgobe was not really deeply into the ICU in the time he was in Schweizer Reneke. But the question of fraud is interesting because what constitutes fraud? Well, in the case of the Port Elizabeth trial in 1940-41, as I was reading the transcript, and very detailed transcript in a Port Elizabeth newspaper, it was very clear that the South African government was taking a very strict definition of fraud. And that is that the money that Kgobe was raising for this fund for the Mark Corporation was going into his personal funds. Now, according to them, that was the basis for the fraud. Again, if you look at the evidence, when you saw Black investors who were, giving small amounts of money to this fund, their evidence generally was we didn't see the difference between it going into the company that he had set up and his personal account. In other words, it didn't make a significant difference to them. So as we're looking at it from a distance, does that constitute fraud? Well, the South African government wanted to convict him, so they used a very strict definition to achieve that. Now, in the Cape Town case, later on, that clearly is fraud. All the evidence and how he exploited a Malay businessman, that was transparent. And so that was something that I think meets that definition. So that's probably something I need to fine tune in terms of defining him as a fraudster. He was certainly an imposter. He was certainly someone who could conjure up stories about himself and anything that he was doing right, left, and center. By the way, I think if he had stayed in England a bit longer, I do think the British police would have brought a case against him for fraud. They were mounting evidence against him. I think in the end, they were just relieved that he decides to go back to South Africa. So they never brought a formal charge against him, but he was clearly defrauding people. Cynthia?
Thanks very much, Bob. I don't know if Neo is able to speak this time. Yes, I think so. Thank you, Neo.
Hello, thank you. Greetings, everybody. Hello, Ndate Bob. Good to see you.
Neo.
You look so young there. So I see now you continue to challenge us to do all these projects. I mean, where's this one coming from? But my comment is, and it's a question really, I see you mentioned our emperor, the Haile Selassie. So it's clear that he was not all like Christ-like. So is there any, just an example that you can elaborate on that? Thank you.
About Haile Selassie being a religious figure.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Well, it's interesting. Before Haile Selassie is crowned emperor, he was the Prince Tafari, Rastafari. And so people in certain places like Jamaica began to create a kind of cult around Haile Selassie, in which he was regarded as a divine figure. That was never the case in South Africa. I've never seen any evidence of people believing that. But certainly he was an iconic figure because of Ethiopia's position in Africa.
Thanks, Bob. I see a hand, it says user, but whoever is behind there, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question. I don't
Sure.
know. Hi.
Yeah, cool. Hi, Bob. It's Brown here.
Hey,
How are you? Yeah. So what I want to know is, was the man buried as a prince or as an ordinary man? Was there confusion when it's supposed to be buried?
you know, one of the problems is that following the drum defamation case, the documentary record on him is just disappears. I don't know what happened to him in the end. The wife that he married in the late 40s, they had a son. I wonder if anyone has information on if the son is still alive, what happens to his estate once he dies. We're dealing with a lot of, at least from my perspective, things that are not knowable. And I keep hoping that some diligent journalist will go out there and do some digging around, and especially people with much deeper knowledge of Soweto and whether his name still registers. I thought that quote from John Machikisa was interesting because at least he was aware of the story. And I think others of his generation were probably aware of it as well. But they didn't know much about his life. And so they, had a sort of positive image of how he dealt with white society and white authority. So I can't answer your question directly. I hope I'm responding.
Yeah, no, I understand. Yeah.
And there's no record of his death in the National Archives.
Yeah.
I'm hoping that one of the black newspapers in the 1950s, they haven't been digitized yet. I'm hoping one of them might have a record of him in the 1960s. So that may be something I'll work through in the future.
All right. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you. I don't know if you can see the comments in the chat, Bob, but there's a couple of comments from Mike Kenyon and then from Cynthia. Are you able to see those? I can read them out. Mike says, a great story, thank you. One can only think of Nicholas Rakela and Hinsa's head and the huge related space post 94. And Cynthia says, Bob, I think the broader context might be about the things you indicated concerning Ethiopianism, its literal and metaphorical spiritual resonances.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm looking at the screen. You just read. I just got the chat questions on. Is this the one about? I think the broader context might be about the
That's it.
things you indicated concerning Ethiopian in its literal and metaphorical spiritual resonances. Yeah, I think that certainly resonates with what was going on in the 1930s, and in particular, I think, and I discussed this in the paper. There was a tremendous amount of outrage in Black South Africa about the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. The Black press was full of stories about what was going on, and they were gaining thousands of readers during that period. And so when Kgobe appears on the scene, reappears on the scene in 1938, he really is tapping into this wellspring of Black outrage about the Italian invasion. And so I think there are a lot of things that do resonate with Ethiopianism on a theological and spiritual level. I never got the impression that Kgobe was really tapping into those aspects of Ethiopianism, but he definitely was tapping into this kind of image, this iconography about Ethiopia that many Black South Africans, actually many people in Africa, you see this in many parts of Africa where Ethiopia becomes this kind of iconic image. And of course, people make of it what they want. So the Rastafari movement in Jamaica has their own interpretation. Yeah.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, I thought it was very interesting how he adopts this Ethiopian identity at a moment when the liberation movement in South Africa is in reaction to Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, adopting this more Pan-African outlook, but definitely there was this response to the war amongst Black South Africans and the liberation movement that is obviously using for his own purposes. I had a question, unless there are others from the participants, around whether he operates. I mean, he's operating with other people, but to what extent are they also part of his con, or is he using these other people as part of a con? And I was wondering about the two wives, the one that travels with him first to Ethiopia and then to Europe, and does she come back to South Africa, and then the second wife. But to what extent is he doing this on his own, or are there others that are part of this?
Well, I'm also curious about what happens to his first wife, who came from the Eastern Cape. She goes with him to Ethiopia and then goes to France. She has problems with a travel document to get on to England, but he later goes back to France to bring her to England. But after that, I have no record of what happens to her. So I don't know if they separated, whether she may have passed away. But we do have a record of him marrying again an Indian woman which creates quite an issue within her family, because there's a record about that, and bringing her from Eastern Cape up to the Transvaal, which they had to get special permission because of the restrictions on Indians in South Africa at that point, on the movement of Indians from one province to another. So yeah, I wish I had more personal details about his life. Once again, if somebody has some detective skills and can figure out, well, is this, maybe this son is still alive. Would he be using the name Wanni Yusaf, or would he have reverted to his father's original name, Kgobe? These are all things that I have not been able to answer.
Thanks very much, Prof. Unless there are any other comments or questions from the participants, I'm gonna ask you to give any final remarks, Prof, before we close the meeting.
Well, again, after this seminar, I hope that this may jog some ideas in your minds about how I can improve this paper. I want to make it a more sort of, I've reconstructed the story as best I can. And I hope there are some suggestions about how I can improve the context for the story in South African life. On the one hand, he seems to be an outlier, someone who sort of stands alone, but he does fit within a number of niches in South African life in the 30s and 40s and 50s. So I welcome any suggestions that you all may have. I can't end this without mentioning that we have an election in this country in a month. And one of the leading candidates is an enormous grifter. So con men have a powerful hold on societies around the world, and it's just something that we're coping with right now. Thank you all very much.
Thanks very much, Prof. And thanks everyone for joining us for this last history workshop seminar for the year. Yeah, thanks to Bob. I hope that you may be able to visit us in the next year or so.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ariana and Noor.
Thanks everyone for participating. Cynthia is saying, I guess Trump wouldn't want to be known as an Ethiopian.
Pardon?
Cynthia is saying in the chat, I guess Trump wouldn't want to be known as an Ethiopian. Thanks very much, all. I'm going to end the meeting. Thanks, Bob. Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.